Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
He's the only quarterback in the history of the Rams to lead the team to 2 NFL championships. First, he did it in 1945 with the Cleveland Rams, and then again in 1951 with the Los Angeles Rams. And he had a pinup poster wife to boot. Next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, Bob Waterfield.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. Today we're going to talk about a terrific quarterback, a Hall of Famer, the only man ever to lead the Rams to 2 NFL championships, Bob Waterfield. And joining me in just a bit to take a look back at the career of number 7 will be Jim Sulecki. Jim is the first guest to make a repeat appearance here on Sports Forgotten Heroes. A while back, Jim was here to talk about the Cleveland Rams. He is the author of a terrific book, The Cleveland Rams, the NFL team that left too soon. An expert on the early history of the Rams franchise, Sulecki spent a great deal of time interviewing Buck Waterfield, who's Bob's son, and he'll share with us a lot from that interview and other research he's conducted as well. As always, thanks to those of you who continue to support Sports Forgotten Heroes like Henry R., Jack K., and Paul F. If you'd like to contribute to Sports Forgotten Heroes, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/sportsfh. That's patreon.com/sportsfh. Check out our website, sportsfh.com. There you can find out more on how to show your support, link back to previous podcasts, learn more about our guests, and see who else is scheduled. Follow us on Twitter at SportsFHeroes and look for our page on Facebook. Also want to let you know that today's podcast is sponsored by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/sportsfh. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Audible is a great way to enjoy your favorite books, especially if you're on the run like I am. Give it a try free at www.audibletrial.com/sportsfh. Hey, you get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial. Bob Waterfield was originally drafted by the Cleveland Rams out of UCLA just in time for the 1945 season. The Rams, a team that had never recorded a winning season, suddenly became a contender with Waterfield under center, and he led the team in his rookie year to an NFL championship over the Washington Redskins. To this day, he is still the only rookie quarterback in NFL history to win the championship. A California boy, Waterfield was thrilled when the Rams left Cleveland for Los Angeles after his rookie year. And just a few years later, he led the Rams to another NFL championship. For his career, Waterfield threw for 97 touchdowns and rushed for another 13. Playing back in the day when you played on each side of the ball, Waterfield was much more than just a quarterback. He was one of the game's best punters and was a terrific defensive back too. And here to talk more about Bob Waterfield is Jim Sulecki. Jim, welcome back to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad to talk to you again.
Great to be here, Warren. Thanks for having me back.
Sure. So last time you were here, we talked about the Cleveland Rams. Today, Bob Waterfield, the quarterback who led those same Cleveland Rams to the NFL championship in 1945, just before they left for Los Angeles. Now, Waterfield didn't mind leaving Cleveland for LA at all. In fact, I think he welcomed it. After all, he was from the LA area and attended UCLA. Tell us about what kind of football player he was in college and how that game translated to the pro game.
Well, good question. Well, first it's kind of good to know what type of athlete he was in college. And Bob, interestingly, went to UCLA on a gymnastics scholarship. His mother was a single parent and kind of encouraged him to go to college. He really had not planned to go to college because his father had passed away when he was about 9 or 10 years old. And but an incredible gymnast, Bob was. Had interviewed his son Buck several times, and Buck talked about how his father had been one of the original gymnasts at Muscle Beach in Santa Monica.
Wow.
How he had in college, he used to kind of do handstands at kind of the edge of a building. And in fact, Buck even had a photo of that. So Bob was this great gymnast and went to college. As I mentioned, probably didn't really even intend to play football. And then finally he went on in his sophomore year and became the quarterback almost immediately in what was then a pretty new T formation offense that they were setting up at UCLA to compete with USC. And Bob was pretty smooth as a quarterback, as you would expect for a guy who was that athletic and had that background in gymnastics. His specialty was the naked bootleg, where the whole offense would go in one direction and then he would kind of just go around in the other direction. And one time, in fact, he even ended up in the end zone, just standing there holding up the ball. The officials hadn't even realized that he had scored a touchdown. So he was a master at concealing the ball, but he could run, he could pass, he could kick, he could punt. He was great on defense. He was a great defensive back, and pretty much he took that style to the program. It was that sort of overall athleticism that I think that took him there, and he could physically do really whatever he sort of set out to do.
Why did he wait so long to go to school? If my research is correct, he graduated high school, then waited about 2 years before going to UCLA. Why was that?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think he might have graduated from high school a little early, but then also he, as I mentioned, his father had passed away, and Bob just had this idea that he was not going to go to college. That was kind of a luxury he couldn't afford. His mom was a single parent; she was a nurse, and so she kind of raised him by herself. And so Bob he went off and worked in an aircraft factory, Douglas Aircraft. He also worked as an actor's double in Hollywood, and so he really just kind of kicked around for a couple of years. And the other thing is that he did not necessarily show, at least on paper, the sort of athletic or I should say football ability that he was soon to have. When he was in high school, he was 6'1", but he only weighed about 155 pounds as a tailback. Played just 1 year. So, but interestingly enough, I had actually gone through these scrapbooks that Bob's mother had kept that are still in the possession of Bob's son Buck. And I found a business card in there for a scout who was a West Coast scout for the Chicago Bears, and whose name was Raymond Fido Murphy. And so I thought that was interesting. And Buck really he wasn't even sure what the background of that was, but it appeared as if just based on his athletic ability, Bob was being scouted by football scouts even when he was in high school. But it's really that whole thing about just kicking around and just thinking he wasn't even going to go to college. He was just going to be like a working man.
And you said he wasn't exactly big. Where did his talent for being a quarterback come from?
He used to, Buck tells stories about how his father, that he had heard from his grandmother, that Bob would go out in the backyard for hours and just throw a football through a tire. It was one of these things where Bob was always a little bit of a loner and kind of quiet, and again, didn't have a father. But that was what he did. He just worked on his passing and his kicking as well. In fact, that's kind of how we got onto on the UCLA team when he went out for the football team in the sophomore year. He was punting and just putting up these absolutely booming punts, and that's what sort of attracted the coaches to him. They got their attention. So it's really once he went to college, his weight went from 155 to about 180, 190, and so all of this sort of coalesced when he was 19 or 20, and that's really when he became the quarterback that everybody remembers.
And he was outstanding in college. So he plays for UCLA in 41 and 42, serves in the Army in 43, comes back in 44, and he sets all sort of single-game records for most passing yards, total offense, season records for most passing yards and touchdowns, all of which have been broken since. But he enjoyed a heck of a career at UCLA. Can you tell us a little bit more about his time playing football at UCLA and just how good he was?
Yeah, he was pretty good. I mean, he was a player's player. He could pass, he could run, he could kick. He could do defense, as I mentioned, and the coaches knew it. They built that whole T formation offense around him because at that point UCLA was kind of in the shadow of USC. USC was just the powerhouse on the West Coast, and UCLA had never defeated USC in football. So they thought Bob was going to be in the T formation offense. This was going to be their breakthrough, in the early 1940s. In Bob's first year in 1941, UCLA tied USC, and probably, as I mentioned in the book, it probably felt like a victory to UCLA fans, just to come to a tie. And but you get the feeling that Bob was always very competitive, and that probably was not enough for him. So, sure enough, in 1942, kind of had his breakthrough season. The Bruins had their first ever victory over USC. They were beginning to gather fans among some of the Hollywood actors. In fact, Mickey Rooney, Ava Gardner were fans of UCLA. So Bob takes them to their first ever Rose Bowl. Unfortunately for Bob and for UCLA, they lost to Georgia in that Rose Bowl 9-0, and Bob threw an interception and had a punt blocked for a touchdown. But nonetheless, here he is. He's bearing in mind this is only probably his second full season he's ever really played quarterback. In 1943, he actually went off into the military in Georgia, which he actually absolutely hated, being in the heat of Georgia.
But he played football there, right?
But he played football, exactly.
Right.
Yep. Played football. You're absolutely right. Played football. Played basketball. In fact, there's a picture in my book on the Cleveland Rams where he's standing there with the rest of the basketball team, and even then, basketball players were fairly tall. But here's Bob, 6'1" with the starters, and he's far and away the shortest guy on the team. And of course, with his usual sort of talismanic sort of number 7, which he wore throughout his entire career and every sport that he played.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But then 1944 was his big breakout year, and this is when he became this great player at UCLA. He was the MVP in the East-West Shriners game in San Francisco on New Year's Day, 1945, and just, again, towering punts. It's interesting how, remembering how the game was back in those days. Punts were every bit as important, the kicking game every bit as important as the passing game in many respects. And so Bob just had these towering punts that pinned the other team, the East team, in their own territory, and that's pretty much how they won. And it was after that game, in fact, that a scout for the Cleveland Rams offered him a contract.
And jumping ahead, way ahead, his punting is what helped the Rams win the 1945 NFL championship over the Washington Redskins because he kept punting the ball and pinning the Redskins deep.
Absolutely. In fact, it was really that game was a tight game, and the Rams were up 15-14 heading into the final minutes. And the Rams throughout the second half, their offense kept stalling after they'd scored 15 points in the first part of the game. And you're absolutely right. Bob just boomed something like a 50 or 60-yard punt, almost a coffin quarter punt, and just backed up the Redskins into their own territory, and with a couple minutes left, and then it was then when Washington they threw an interception, and that was the end of the game. So yeah, Bob's punting in that game was hugely important.
So I jumped ahead. Let's go back. He finishes up college. And when you take a look back at the 1944 NFL draft, Waterfield wasn't taken until the 5th round. He was the 42nd overall pick. So 3 questions here. 1, why did so many teams pass on Waterfield? 2, why did the Rams finally select him? And 3, how did the draft differ back then from how it's conducted today.
Well, it is amazing how they passed on Bob, until that third round. A little bit back then was that it was sort of a bias towards Eastern players. And players out on the West Coast were, that was just so far away for most of the football establishment then. So I think Bob was a little bit off the radar then. In that first round, interestingly enough, the Rams GM, Chili Walsh, took a player named out of Purdue, Big Ten, named Tony Butkovich. And then this is really telling for 1944. They had no idea. Chili Walsh had no idea that this gentleman had died the day before on Okinawa in a Marine invasion.
That's awful.
Yeah.
That's awful.
It's just, isn't that terrible? But it just goes to show that the lack of communication. Then, the guy they did take in the second round was Gil Booley again, but he was from Boston College, an Eastern player, and ended up being a pretty solid lineman for the Rams until 1950. At the same time, though, Chili Walsh had gotten some reports that that he was a little bit of an erratic performer, that he was a little bit temperamental, and there was some truth to that. Bob, again, was a little taciturn, was I guess the best way to describe him. And in fact, Jane Russell, his wife, called him Old Stoneface. So I think some of those kind of reports got back to, I think, Chili, which kind of probably put him off, and probably some of the other teams as well. Why did the Rams finally select him? Chili Walsh, and really, Chili Walsh deserves to be, I think, remembered by football historians more than he is. He drafted 3 future Hall of Fame players within a couple years with the Rams when they were in Cleveland, and one of them was Bob Waterfield. And what he did was he started to the Rams were just perennially sort of a second division team, and he just kept getting kind of second, picked over players. Because the Bears, the Redskins, the powerhouse teams at the time just tended to have better leads on players coming out of the big schools. So what Chili did was, first of all, he hired what is thought to be the first ever scout in NFL history. And then he started to look at kind of the off the radar schools. He started to look, he looked at the Big Ten, but he also looked in the South. He looked in the West. Looked at some of the lesser schools like UCLA, again, kind of was, second tier compared to USC. And he also, by the way, looked for players who were then in the military. He really took a gamble and thought, well, I'm going to set up this team to be successful after the war. And Bob was one of those guys. Yeah. So when Bob was drafted in 1944, he was indeed still in the military. So Chili was kind of taking a gamble there. But, and to some respect, because there was no immediate need for the Rams to win. They didn't have that big of a fan base. They weren't really a winning team. Chili had a little bit of that luxury to sort of draft players for the future, whereas, as I say, the established teams like the Bears, the Giants, the Packers, the Redskins, they had to play for now, even during the war. You mentioned how did the draft differ. I mean, you think today the draft is like a multiple day spectacle, and back then it was just done in a hotel room with, a blackboard in a couple hours. As I mentioned, some of the GMs didn't even know the players that they were going to pick.
Yeah. And some might have passed away before the draft.
Exactly. Yeah. So how telling was that? How the draft was back then?
He didn't disappoint in his first year either. He rushed for 5 touchdowns, threw for 14, and in the championship game, he was 14 of 27 for 192 yards and 2 touchdowns. One was a 39-yard strike to Jim Benton, and the other was a 44-yard pass to Jim Gillette. He was definitely the best player on the field that day, and he was named the league's MVP. I mean, not only was he throwing the ball and connecting for touchdown passes, as we talked about earlier, he was also a heck of a punter and pinned the Redskins deep. He was also the first rookie to ever lead a team to the NFL championship, as the Rams downed the Skins that year 15-14. However, as you noted, while he is the only rookie and still the only rookie at quarterback to ever lead a team to an NFL championship, there is an asterisk there because of Sammy Baugh. Explain that to me.
Yeah, Sammy Baugh actually was, as a rookie, took the Redskins to the NFL championship in 1937. But in those days, he was a tailback. In the single wing offense, the tailback was the primary passer. So by the mid 40s, of course, now the most of the passing duties have swung to the quarterback, and that was when Bob then took the Rams to the championship as a quarterback. So Bob was technically the first rookie quarterback to take a team to an NFL championship. And incidentally, that's a record that still stands to this day. You think of all the great quarterbacks that have come through the NFL since then, and not a single one of them has managed to take a team to the NFL championship in his rookie year.
Incredible. So the Rams in that 44 draft found themselves a stud who leads them to the championship. Now, you had mentioned that Chili Walsh was basically building for the future. Did he realize the future would come so quickly? Did the Rams expect to win a championship in 45 after all those awful years that they had previous to 45? And did they expect Waterfield to perform at such a high level in 1945?
I think I think they had a bit of an inkling. Chili Walsh said in 1944, he was quoted as saying, he said, we are going to be basically, the Rams are going to be a force to be reckoned with after the war. And in that score, he was absolutely right. I mean, the Rams from, 45 to 55 is arguably, and I've got a story on a website called ramstalk.net that argues that was the greatest period of the Rams history in many respects. But I think they had some inkling that the team was getting better. They had the core of a team that had gone 500 in 1944, even with players kind of coming and going, through the military and coming back from the military. And but then I think with Waterfield, no, I don't think they thought he was going to be that great that fast. Although in training camp that year in 1945, in August 1945, as I note, the same month that the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, so it was ending the war. Yeah. The head coach of the Rams, Adam Walsh, had said that he had a pretty good feeling that this team was going to be kind of a great team, and but nobody else really knew. It was pretty much the rest of the league had no idea who Waterfield was. He had played, as I mentioned, was kind of somewhat of a secondary school. He was not an All-American, which in those days was considered almost, you had to be an All-American to be a kind of a respected player. So I think the team internally knew that they were going to be good, maybe not that fast, but they certainly snuck up on the rest of the NFL, no doubt about that.
Yeah, what did the rest of the league think about the Rams? I mean, here's a team that had previously only finished at 500 one time. Chili Walsh is building a team for the future. They arrive, they go 9-1, led by a rookie quarterback. Tell me about that season. Tell me about that game.
Well, the game, was great, and I talked about it in the previous podcast. But it was almost an epic game. It's considered, one of the most interesting title games of all time. It's bitter cold in Cleveland Stadium. Straw was ringing the field that they put down to sort of insulate the field. I mean, it looked almost kind of post-apocalyptic. The field. The Redskins were the powerhouse. It had won championships prior to that. The Rams, of course, had never even been a 500 team or a better than 500 team up until that season.
Mm-hmm.
Yet the Rams came in as a 3 or 4 point favorite, in no small part because they had a tough schedule. And also interesting heading into that game is that the Rams owner Daniel Reeves had just given Waterfield a brand new 3-year contract that nearly tripled his salary. So, Dan Reeves would go on to show that he really invested in his payroll, but so that got a lot of publicity, a lot of attention heading in the game. And how could they give, before he's even finished his first season, how could they give triple the salary of this rookie quarterback? So some of the sports writers in Cleveland were absolutely beside themselves.
Let me interrupt you for a second. What did the rest of the team think at that time? What did players think about something like that?
I think I think they were probably okay with it because here was a guy who, came in and really just, in many respects, almost single-handedly sort of transformed the Rams from a 500 team to, a championship team. And the other thing is, I think there's a little bit of, I think they're, to some extent, they're a little bit starstruck. I mean, here's Bob coming in, married to, to Jane Russell, who at the time was the, the preeminent sort of, movie star and sex symbol of her time. In fact, Bob would bring Jane Russell to some of the after game sort of get-togethers for the players and some of the sports writers who covered them, and suffice to say that was was very popular when she showed up. So from what I can gather is they kind of embraced him. I don't think there was any animosity there at all.
So 1945, depending on how you look at it, was just the beginning, or maybe it was just the end. For Waterfield and the Rams, it was the beginning. For Waterfield and Cleveland, it was the end. The Rams left Cleveland 27 days after they won the championship, and they left for Los Angeles. What, if any, role did Waterfield play in that? One thing's for sure, he didn't mind going out there. In fact, as I said earlier, he liked it, didn't he?
Yeah, he did like it. I mean, and Bob was honestly thrilled about it. He and his wife Jane. I mean, they only spent about 2 or 3 months in Cleveland. They kept a little apartment in Cleveland. They were not at all prepared for the cold. I mean, you're talking about two kids basically here who have spent their pretty much their entire lives in Southern California. So Jane wrote an interesting autobiography in the mid '80s, which I kind of drew upon a little bit for the book. But she said, "Boy, we didn't like either the heat in Georgia or the cold in Ohio." So they were thrilled to go back home to Van Nuys, where the two of them had grown up. And so, what role do they have? Hard to say what role Bob had. Van Nuys, of course, wanted to move to California, which came out later. And as I mentioned in the book, he had seen a USC game at the LA Coliseum 10 years earlier when he was college age, and he was absolutely astounded by the size of the Coliseum. Football was big even then on the West Coast. There were a lot of big semi-pro teams, and of course USC was always a powerhouse. He was smitten by California. This is the pre-war, sort of freeway crazed LA. So he was wanting to move to California. As I mentioned, Chili Walsh, the general manager, Adam Walsh, his brother, who is the head coach, they were both California natives. Both, in fact, had gone to Hollywood High School. So I mean, there was a little bit of a feeling later, like, you have these multiple people on the Rams franchise at the time who either had connections to LA or wanted to have connections to LA. And then, I think there was a little bit of, Bob might have been a little bit of a factor in there. I mean, he was the franchise player. As I mentioned, far and away the highest player on the team. Obviously, it was in their best interest to keep him happy.
Sure.
The Rams are very cognizant that Jane Russell, was a star. In fact, his signing Bob, Chili Walsh, said something along the lines of, well, hey, he's married to Jane Russell, and that didn't make signing him any easier. So there might have been, all these kind of factors kind of coalesced. And, the kind of the fallout was that for some years after that, some Clevelanders sort of continued, blame Jane Russell for the Rams leaving, that she had this sort of, like inexorable sort of pull of pulling Bob out of Cleveland.
How did Bob meet Jane Russell, and what was their relationship like? I mean, ultimately they did get a divorce, but let's talk about that in a little bit. What was their relationship like, and how did they meet?
They met, when they were in high school. They're kind of high school sweethearts. Both had grown up, as I mentioned, in the San Fernando Valley. They went to Van Nuys High School. And I don't know if you know anything about Van Nuys High School, but it's sort of this iconic high school. I mean, Marilyn Monroe went there, Robert Redford went there, Natalie Wood, Sally Field.
Wow.
Don Drysdale went there. So, in fact, it was the high school in the movie Fast Times at Ridgemont High. So so they met in high school at this sort of very, iconic sort of Southern California high school. By all accounts, Bob kind of catted around a little bit before he started dating Jane. In fact, by nearly all accounts, he continued to play around a little bit even after they were married, which of course caused a lot of friction there. But they were inseparable for a long time. Buck Waterfield, their adopted son, told me, he said, it was really love-hate between those two. He said they couldn't be apart from each other, but they really couldn't be together either. Bob was very earthy. He loved to hunt. He loved to fish. Jane was artistic in effect. She was very spiritual, like even religious, which might be a little surprising given that, she had a role in this risque Howard Hughes movie called The Outlaw. So they were very similar and very attracted to each other almost from the start. But again, they were different enough people that they just had this tension between them. But yeah, at the height of their careers, they were, as Buck told me, they were the king and queen of L.A. They had a house with a big pool up in the hills that overlooked the San Fernando Valley, and life was good for them for quite a long time.
So let's go back to the field. They move out to California. They play in Los Angeles. They're coming off an NFL championship. They had gone 9-1. Their first year in L.A., they didn't do as well. They went 6-4-1. Waterfield had a decent season. What happened? Why the slide?
It's hard to say exactly what happened that first year in L.A. Many people thought they were going to repeat their championship in 1946, although others did also say, thought very little of the Rams and said that they were a fluke, and that the Chicago Bears would reassert their sort of reign over the league. But as I mentioned in the book, Sport Magazine called the Rams sport's first spectacular post-war team.
Wow.
Yeah, which is interesting. I mean, that was the sort of the cloud that they left Cleveland under. Travel obviously didn't impact them that much. They had about a home record that was about the same as on the road.
Yep.
Even though back in those days, I mean, a train ride from Chicago to L.A. was 45 hours. So to play on the road in L.A.
not
to
easy.
go from L.A., it was not easy. They had a huge new stadium. They had played at Cleveland Stadium a little bit, but you get the LA Coliseum, that's something like 20% bigger than Cleveland Stadium. They lost a few players to the Browns, which I think we talked about in our last interview.
Sure.
Chet Adams, who is the team captain, and Don Greenwood, who is the star fullback. So they lost a few players there. And they had honestly some controversy on the team that first year as well, because they, as a condition of getting in the LA Coliseum, they signed a few African American players, Kenny Washington and Woody Strode. And there were some reports that came out that even internally within the Rams camp, some of the players, particularly some of the players from the South, weren't real thrilled about that. So there was a little bit of that dissension, within the team. And it probably just goes without saying. I mean, in 1946, the rest of the league returned to full strength. All the military people were back home. Bob didn't sneak up on the league like in 1946, like he had in 45. That said, he still had a pretty good year in 46. It's one of his best years. He was first team All-Pro that year, and I think that year he had a league-leading 17 touchdown passes.
Yep,
so he
sure did.
He did pretty good.
Like Jim said, 1946 was one of Bob's best years. He completed 127 of 251 pass attempts. Both figures led the NFL, and his 17 touchdown passes also led the league. He did have a tendency, though, to throw the ball to the other team. In 1946, he threw 17 interceptions. In fact, if there is a downside to his career, it's that he threw 128 interceptions while only connecting for 97 touchdown passes. On the other side of the ball, in 1946, playing defensive back, Bob intercepted the ball 5 times and also recovered 3 fumbles. Now, before we get back to my conversation with Jim, just a quick reminder that today's podcast is sponsored by Audible. And for listeners of Sports Forgotten Heroes, we have a terrific offer for you. Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. Over 180,000 titles available from history to fiction to sports and more. Give Audible a try. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/sportsfh. Again, that's audibletrial.com/sportsfh for your free audiobook. Hey, if you're like me, running through airports, sitting on planes, racing from location to location, and you just can't find the time to sit down and read, and you don't like lugging around a heavy book, Audible is great. Give it a try. It's free. Now, back to Bob Waterfield. One other note about Bob. He was also the Rams' kicker, and in 1946 he connected on 6 of 9 field goal attempts and led the league by making 37 of 37 extra point attempts. And he had his best year punting with an average of 44.7 yards per punt. They're 6-4-1 in 46. They play 47, they're fine. They play 48, they're fine, but they don't get into a championship. Along comes 1949, and while they didn't do anything spectacular, it was the beginning of a run. In fact, Waterfield enjoyed a wonderful year in 1949. What can you tell us about his performance on the field in 1949 and the championship game against Philadelphia?
Yeah, this is like the Rams, Waterfield, they had kind of a few years in the wilderness there, and which is a little odd because here's Bob, he's back home and he's, presumably more comfortable. But yeah, in 1949, the Rams finally got that groove back, and as I mentioned, they were really hitting probably one of the greatest streaks in their franchise history. Bob was first team All-Pro for the first time since 46. The Rams have one of the top offenses in the league. But it's also interesting to note too, and we'll get into this a bit. Bob also had sort of a propensity to throw interceptions as well. So he had 24 interceptions that season, which was the most in the league.
Wow!
And so while it was a great season, and they vied with they came down to a championship game with the Eagles. But Bob was starting to show this sort of, as I mentioned, kind of a propensity to throw interceptions, and I think that is probably what started to kind of shake that hold that he had as a starting quarterback.
Yeah, and especially came to light in 1950, which I find very interesting. So here he leads the team to a championship game, comes back in 1950. And he winds up splitting time with the Flying Dutchman, Norm Van Brocklin. They each started 6 games that year. Is that because of Bob's propensity to throw interceptions? What happened? Why split the role at quarterback?
Yeah, I think it probably was. Here you had two quarterbacks who probably had kind of fallen into sort of like, kind of co-parity. I mean, in that 49 championship game, they were shut out by the Eagles, 14-0. And Bob and Norm Van Brocklin both had, pretty similar games, which is to say, not that great. But I think, Bob went like 5 of 13 and Van Brocklin went like 5 of 15. So I think he kind of fell into this sort of, okay, what happened? Our offense stalled. We have 2 quarterbacks both of whom show a lot of potential. So I think as they hit in 1950, I think they're trying to get something going. And it might have been a little bit of that old accusation about Bob being an erratic performer, that Chili Walsh had heard years earlier, that kind of came back to haunt him. The other interesting thing too is, and they started, as you mentioned, they had sort of co-starters. Bob was strangely enough not all that popular in L.A. And which I find a little bit puzzling. Yeah, and when I was conducting research for my book, I interviewed Joe Horrigan, who's kind of the lead historian at the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and Joe had an interesting take on that. He said, think about it. It's almost like a reverse hero worship. You got a guy here who's good looking. He's a star athlete. Probably could have been an actor, married to a movie star. It was almost like when Bob failed to deliver that championship in those first couple years in L.A., the long knives started to come out on him. So, you had this thing, you're kind of assuming that Bob was going to be a hero in his hometown, but for some reason he was never all that popular there.
Could that possibly be from, or is there any evidence whatsoever that his life off the field, being married to Jane Russell, had any effect on his performance on the field?
Yeah, it's possible. They certainly had their erratic times, and even, almost from the get-go in their relationship, actually. And there's parts in Jane Russell's autobiography where she talks about how, she talked him into getting a beach house at Malibu, and so she wanted to spend weekends in Malibu. But Bob was a guy who, he stuck close to home almost his entire career. Bob spent his entire life in Southern California, save for that year that he spent in Georgia, and the 3 months he spent in Cleveland. He was kind of a guy he was kind of a homebody, kind of a homeboy, and so there was tension going on there. Yeah, to your point, even then, and probably that was a bit of a distraction, for Bob through that.
So 1950, he splits time with Norm Van Brocklin. In the playoffs, he comes off the bench against the Bears to help the Rams beat Chicago. And then in the championship game against the Cleveland Browns, he threw an 82-yard touchdown pass to Glenn Davis on the game's first play. But they lost to Cleveland 30-28. It was another terrific game, another terrific season. Was it his performance in the playoffs that led him to being named the undisputed number one quarterback for the team for the 1951 season?
I think it probably was. I mean, Bob was all set to be the hero in that 1950 championship game. As you mentioned, the Rams came out firing on the first play in Cleveland Stadium. 82-yard pass, and boy, that just put the Browns back on their heels. The crowd has silenced the crowd, and the Rams were ahead most of that game. And the Browns just kind of kept coming back and kept coming back. Bob was undone by Otto Graham's, drive, which was kind of this almost like, John Elway-ish kind of, drive. And it was the proverbial 2-minute drill. And it left, when it came down to Lou Groza kicking the game-winning field goal with like 28 seconds left. So, so there goes that whole legendary sort of performance for Bob. But I think, probably they saw something that day. Bob had kind of matched Otto Graham that day in passing yardage, and the only difference was that Graham connected for 4 touchdowns, and Bob only had that one.
Right.
But I think probably, So I think they saw something there, and they, and that's why he became the, now back to the undisputed number one quarterback in 1951.
As the number one quarterback, how much time did he spend on the field playing defense, and just how good an overall player was he at that time of his career?
Platooning started to come in, so obviously I think his time on defense lessened. But he was when he was playing defensive back. He was the full package. Just as I mentioned, there are things that he could do that hardly any other player was able to do. Really did prior to him or did after him, really. And as a defensive back, he was, as I mentioned in the book, in the 1945 championship game. If you see him, and I study the film from that game, it's really interesting to see. He really had a touchdown saving tackle about the 30-yard line against the Redskins. There's a running back was off to the races. It looked like he was going to score a touchdown, and Waterfield caught him almost by the shoestring, and kind of as the guy was going out of bounds. And that pretty much kept the Redskins from scoring a touchdown. They attempted a field goal and then missed the field goal, and that was kind of the difference in that game. So Bob was a fantastic defensive back. And his kicking, his kicking was really what was kind of his signature thing in many respects. The story about him was that he could, and this is a story that's relayed to me by his son Buck, he could place kicks from the 50-yard line and literally hit a water bucket in the end zone. Wow. Time after time. He was that accurate. And he did it so many times that his teammates started to call him water buckets, and then they started to call him just buckets, and then they finally started to call him Buck. And that was kind of his nickname, which then he gave his son. So, So it's going back to being a defensive back. He had. I was just looking up last night. He had 20 interceptions in 4 seasons.
Wow. Let me ask you this: as a quarterback and a place kicker, you face a lot of pressure. How much did playing in the defensive backfield? How much did he enjoy that? There couldn't have been as much pressure being a DB as there is as being a QB.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. It's obviously it's somewhat similar skills, to some respects. So, but Yeah, it might have been a little bit of a different kind of a relief valve. The fact that those players played both ways back in those days, it's mind-boggling today. Although at the same time, what's interesting too is, the 1945 championship game, as I mentioned, how cold it was. One member of the Browns or the Rams who was on both sides, played both ways, said, it wasn't that bad for those of us who were on the field on both offense and defense. He said, I felt bad for the guys who were on the bench, So I think back in those days, a lot of these players liked to play both ways, and then, they probably found it rewarding.
Sure. 1951 was perhaps his most satisfying year. He started 10 games for the Rams. They went 7-3 in those 10 games. He led them to the NFL title over the Cleveland Browns. Finally, another championship. How satisfying a year was that for him? And no clue that this was truly the beginning of the end for him as well.
Right. Oh, yeah, for sure satisfying. And here he is. He brings an NFL championship, to Los Angeles, which incidentally is still the only championship that the Rams have ever won in Southern California.
And they're the only team to have won a championship in 3 different cities, having won in Cleveland, L.A., and St. Louis.
Absolutely. Yep, it was singular distinction for the Rams. It was Bob's second championship, which probably helped him later to lock up his induction into the Hall of Fame. Here now he's won championships in 2 different cities, 6 years apart. And individually, he had a really good year that year. He led the league in passer rating. He threw the longest TD pass of the year that year. And by the way, he also threw the fewest interceptions of his career that season. So that was other than his 45 season, that might have been his most memorable season.
So he has a great year in 51, leads the team to the championship. His fewest interceptions comes to 52, and it's Norm Van Brocklin's job. I don't get it. Explain that to me.
Yeah, he did start 6 of the games that season, but I think it kind of goes back to that 51 championship game. They won the championship. But yet, at the same time, Bob he started the game, but he also threw 2 interceptions in that game, and no touchdowns. Whereas Norm Van Brocklin threw the game-winning touchdown to Tom Fears. So I think it probably has something to do with that. It almost seems as if the coaches then they're kind of going based on the performance of the most recent game. So I think it was a little bit of that. But another really critical factor was that Bob was, and it was not as well known then, Bob was developing an ulcer. That was caused by stress. Yeah, he was told it potentially could have killed him. When he went to see a doctor, he said, the doctor said he told him that he was kind of psychologically unsuited to be a player because he just assumed too much personal responsibility for the team's performance. So,
he was the quarterback. He was the quarterback and the place kicker. All the points come from him.
Exactly. So I think that probably affected his performance as well. Clearly he was just not feeling good that season, and yet he was only in his early 30s. So
just 32.
That's really why, right? So that's really why he retired. It was really to save his own life.
So they honored him. He announced his retirement as the season was wearing down, and they honored him. And now I guess there's some question as to whether or not they actually did indeed retire his number. But in your interviews with his son, Buck, he says, well, I don't know if the number was actually retired. They just don't issue it anymore. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it's one of these, kind of strange things. Everywhere you look, if you look it up on Pro Football Reference or whatever, they have the retired numbers for the Rams, and according to Buck, is that they never technically officially retired Bob's number 7. All the trainers and the coaches and everything just have never given out that number 7 to any player subsequent to Bob. But according to Buck, they've never officially retired it. So if anyone listening to this has any insight on that, I'd be really interested to know, because it's a little bit of a technicality, and obviously it kind of hurts the Waterfield family a little bit. The fact that the Rams organization has never done this.
Interesting. When he retired, he held the NFL career records for extra points and field goals. Overall, he averaged 42.4 yards as a punter, completed 814 passes for 11,849 yards and 97 touchdowns. but he didn't go away. He remained in the game as an assistant coach, and later he was a head coach of the Rams, where he went 9-24-1 from 1960 through 62. He wasn't that successful. What were his shortcomings as a coach? Why didn't he succeed?
Well, as I mentioned, Bob wasn't probably the most engaging person. Although I don't know, that might have been a bit of a factor as a coach. But really, by all accounts, Bob was given a rebuilding team. The Rams were going through some really lean times in the field then. They made some bad trades. And there's a lot of bickering that was going on in the front office. So I think it's kind of considered one of the sadder episodes. There's a lot of NFL quarterbacks who went on to be fairly mediocre head coaches, and Bob is one of them. And it's a little sad for Bob because it was sort of again, he was handed kind of a difficult situation. But it's kind of funny. I mean, but that said, Bob kind of accepted responsibility for it, but in his usual sort of laconic way. When he was fired, the press asked him, so, what kind of coach did you think you had been? And he said, his usual one-word way, losing. So Bob, it's a little bit unfortunate that that's kind of how that wrapped up, but he was kind of dealt a little bit of a raw deal there.
And unfortunately, a short time later, his marriage to Jane Russell, it didn't succeed either. They divorced in 1968, and from what I've read, she just didn't like his late-night antics. But before the divorce, they appeared to have it going on. They were producing movies. They adopted 3 children. What was his relationship like with Jane during that time? What were his golden years like?
Well, probably tempestuous kind of maybe best describes, Bob's and Jane's years together. As I mentioned, Buck put it well when he said his parents couldn't stand to be apart, but they also couldn't be together. That kind of just ended up being, proving to be the undoing of their relationship. Both Bob and Jane ended up remarrying. But I think it's interesting. I mentioned about Jane's autobiography from the 80s, and if you read through it, she spends relatively little time on her second and third husbands. And part of it is because she wasn't with them as much for as many years. But if you read the book, it's nearly all Bob, nearly to the end of the autobiography, and you can really tell that she really never quite fully got over him. But Bob just sort of forged on, and you mentioned what were his golden years like. He just kept pushing forward. He had started off in his teens not thinking that he would even play football, and then once he got into it, he realized he didn't want to leave. And in fact, he never really did leave football. As you mentioned, he coached. He was a movie producer for a few years with Jane. They sort of set up a kind of a joint movie production company, but that's sort of fizzled a little bit. Did become a scout for the Rams. He's credited with drafting players like Roman Gabriel and Merlin Olsen, Deacon Jones.
Yep. But
as you mentioned, he had his late night antics. He hung out with his old friends. Never liked to be treated as a celebrity. Buck told me, was very uncomfortable with any sort of star, worship or hero worship or anything. But yeah, by all accounts, came to enjoy a little bit too much nightlife. And when he died in 1983, he was only 62.
Way too young. He was elected to the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1965. Sum up his career for us. Just how good was Bob Waterfield? What should we remember about Bob Waterfield?
Interestingly, there's no unanimity on Bob's inclusion in the Hall of Fame. For the most part, I think people accept it. And although it's also a little bit sad that Bob's name is beginning to sort of fade a little bit.
Which is why I wanted to do this podcast, Sports Forgotten Heroes, and Bob Waterfield, a Hall of Fame member, a 2-time NFL championship quarterback, should not be forgotten.
Agree, and for a number of reasons. And one thing, kind of one knock against him, partly is, and of course there's always debates as to who should be inducted into Halls of Fame. But, one thing, the big knock on Bob is that he threw more interceptions than touchdowns across his career. But, I would say that he deserves to be in. As you mentioned, he won 2 NFL championships, 6 years apart, 2 different cities. He was, by all accounts, an athlete of just a supreme degree who excelled on both sides of the ball. That whole part of the game, of course, is also lost to history, how hard it was to play both sides of the ball. And I would also suggest, that that he was in many ways sort of the prototype of the modern quarterback. You know, he was smart, he was elusive, he was able both to run and pass. As I say in my book, he would look familiar. His style of play would look very familiar on, you know, flat screen TVs as today. You know, Bob did that. This was not leatherhead football. If you go back and watch it, there's some complex play calling that's going on, and a lot of interesting movement that Bob is doing. And then, of course, to be able to place, kick, and punt as well. You know, as I mentioned, there was no one quite like that before him, and there's certainly no one after him. So I think what people should remember about him, and his son Buck has really emphasized as well, Bob was truly one of the greatest athletes ever to play pro football. He was just a fully gifted, almost kind of Bo Jackson sort of player in some respects. And then just why should we remember him? Just from a personal perspective, his life is intriguing. You know, in fact, I think there's a book or a movie there that's just kind of waiting to happen. You know, I mentioned, as Buck said, you know, at the height of their careers in the 40s and 50s, you know, his parents were the king and queen of L.A. You know, he was good looking, this former actor, you know, championship athlete, and just an all around kind of Hollywood type of guy, married to his celebrity wife. You know, I mean, Tom Brady and Giselle of the 2010s, you know, would have nothing on Bob Waterfield and Jane Russell of the 40s and 50s. And it's just a really fascinating story of that sort of unique time in American history and in American sports.
Jim, thank you so much for joining me once again on Sports Forgotten Heroes. I really enjoyed our conversation. Certainly hope you did too, and would hope once again you'd consider coming back.
Absolutely, Warren. It's been fun, and I'll be happy to do that anytime.
Awesome. Thank you. Bob Waterfield was elected to the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1965, along with Patty Driscoll, Danny Fortman, Otto Graham, Sid Luckman, and Steve Van Buren. For his career, he connected for 97 touchdowns, twice leading the league with 14 in 1945 and 17 in 1946. Bob completed 50.3% of his passes, and in the playoffs he added another 6 touchdown passes while completing 50.4% of his passes, and he led the Rams to the NFL championship in 1945 and 1951. Coaching, however, that was another story. In his first year, 1960, Bob and the Rams went 4-7-1, and he followed that with a 4-10 mark in 1961. He was finally relieved of his duties midway through the 62 season after going 1-7. It was as a player, however, where Bob Waterfield really made his mark, and he played the game incredibly well. He's the only quarterback to win 2 championships for the Rams, and is still the only rookie quarterback to lead his team to an NFL championship. For more information on Bob Waterfield, please visit our website, sportsfh.com. There I have links to articles, videos, and stats on Bob. Follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Check out our Facebook page and check out our Patreon page, patreon.com/SportsFH. In the coming weeks on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to talk more about some of football's forgotten stars, look at some of the NBA and NHL's forgotten stars, and a whole lot more. Thanks again to my guest, Jim Sulecki. His book, The Cleveland Rams, the NFL Team That Left Too Soon, can be found wherever you get your books, places like Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And he also has a great website called clerams.com. That's CLERAMS.com. There you can find out more information on Bob Waterfield and the first incarnation of the Rams franchise. Thanks again for spending some time with me, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of FilmMusic.io.